And right conduct is what Cicero called the golden rule, or the following of the natural laws that we walk and operate in every day. If we're walking in public virtue, then we will automatically file or walk in those natural laws. In the 18th century, the view was a special character, is what they considered it. They considered this public virtue a special character in individuals. Um, it says what they described it as was a willingness of the individual to sacrifice his private interest for the good of the community or the commonwealth. Such patriotism is what they called that, or love of country is public virtue. Now that comes from a quote from Gordon Woods in a book he wrote called "The Creation of an American Republic." So it was the attitude or the mindset of the founders, or of most people, in fact, in the 18th century, that if we had what we called public virtue, then we were willing to sacrifice our self interest for the public good or for the good of the commonwealth. And that was a love of country or patriotism. That's not the way we describe all those things today. It's the way we should be, but it's not how most people describe them. Because you see, we don't find too many people in our society today that are willing to self sacrifice for the good of the whole. But you see, when we get back into the Word of God, that is exactly what Jesus is talking about in Matthew, where he says that where he's asked, first of all, what's the greatest commandment in the law? And he says to love the Lord thy God with all thy soul and all thy mind and all thy heart. And then he says, and the second is to love thy neighbor as thyself. That is the love he's talking about, that self sacrifice. You see, Jesus Christ is the example that we as Christians are supposed to be following. And Cicero's point was, it's not just the Christians who can see this, it's the natural law of God. And most people recognize this as being the absolute truth that we need to govern our lives by. And Jesus's example was the cross of Calvary, where he suffered tremendously for the good of all humanity. That suffering is the love of God. Now, most Christians, they don't see that, and most of the world, they think love is some secondhand emotion like the songwriters sang. But the truth of the matter is, if you don't sacrifice for something, you really don't love it. If you don't sacrifice for your family, you really don't love them. If you don't sacrifice for your children, you really don't love them. If you don't sacrifice for this nation, you really don't love it. You're really not a patriot if you're not willing, see. This was the attitude that they needed to see displayed in the society around them at the time of the revolution. It was the brutality of the Britain that pushed the Americans in the edge of the ability to self-govern, because they saw that behavior, and when they saw that behavior in them, they created that same brutality, that same pushing, that same pressure that continued on, is what the citizens of the colonies realized had to be rooted out of their own society. But you see, we didn't learn anything from that, because when you fast forward to World War I, at the end of World War I, if you recall, we had the Treaty of Versailles that came on. And that Treaty of Versailles was a brutality or a stringent restriction against Germany and all of those countries that lost the war, and we were turning the screws on. We weren't going to let it up. We were going to make it happen, bless God. We were going to just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and putting the pressure on. And because of that treaty, and because of the unwillingness of the United Nations that were pushing for the screws to be turned, guess what come out of all that? A man named Adolf Hitler. And that because of the treaty and the pressures that were being pushed on, that allowed the perfect storm for Adolf Hitler to rise up and become powerful. And then guess what we had? World War II. And now we've got Putin over there putting the pressure on. And what are we doing? We're putting the pressure on. We're pushing the pressure on, pushing. We haven't learned anything. And now he's just keep resisting and resisting. And if we don't back off, this thing's going to blow up in our face. That's what happened to the king. The king kept putting the pressure on the colonies, and the colonies were realizing that they were giving in to the lavish type lifestyle, and they were seeing that mirrored thing. And then Thomas Paine, if you read his common sense commentaries that began to be published, this was 3 years before the Revolution, by the way. He began to write those commentaries that they've compiled into a book called Common Sense into the newspapers, and the people were reading them. Back then, the newspapers and the media wasn't as corrupt as it is now, and they have it unbiased, and they printed those kinds of things. And he began to talk about the common results of these things in the society, and they began to see the society as a whole started to change its attitude from a selfish self-centeredness to a attitude of sacrifice for the good of the nation, because luxury, indulgence, amusement, and pleasure were the only things that were interested by the kingdom in Britain. And when they saw those things being characteristics in the Americas, they realized that they needed to shift from that self-centered attitude to an attitude of what the folks called public virtue. And because they did, the nation became the America that we are today. And almost every man in the country had the ability at that point to own property. I'm not saying they were all property owners, but they had the ability to own property, and that's what made them what they called freeholders. And that was the difference in the mindset and the attitude of the people before the revolution began. And they began to have a reform of consciousness. A great reform started growing into the colonies. And John Jay and Robert Morrison and Robert Livingston, they began to see these people exhibiting the potential and the capacity for public virtue. And they began to realize that they were probably going to be able to self-govern, and that if we were going to get a government and operate in self-government, that now is the time, because the people's attitudes for the self-sacrifice were at its highest point, and they knew that that's what it was going to take. James Madison said that there was a spirit of liberty and patriotism amazing in all degree and in all denominations of men. And he was ready to see things get pushed forward into what they needed to be for the operations of a long-term self-sufficient government. And Thomas Jefferson, he believed in what was called a natural aristocrat, those that were born leaders. There was a natural leadership, and then there was the unnatural leadership. And he's talking about those that were brought into those positions of power, because in the king's kingdom, that was an unnatural aristocrat. They were brought in there by birthright. They were brought in there by name. They were brought in there by all kinds of attributes other than their abilities to do right, see? And what Thomas Jefferson said was that there needed to be a natural leaders, not those described to serve, or desiring to serve, rather, but those that were naturally capable of doing the right thing, because that's what was necessary, see? And all of these other kingdoms, they just had people because of their social class or their social status to be in these positions. So the founding fathers, in order to kind of draft some of that honor into the public office, they used quotes from Cicero. We go back to Cicero, And he says there is really no other occupation in which human virtue approaches more closely to the august function of the gods than that of founding new states or preserving those already in existence. See, that was a quote of Cicero that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and some of them, they began to push into the public views to get people to read and get them to understand, and that there was honor in public service, and that there was patriotism, and integrity to be these leaders. And John Adams and Samuel Adams both were great sacrifice. They sacrificed a lot to be in the public office. They both sacrificed their fortunes. They both sacrificed, a lot of the easy avenues of their life, you might say, in order to be in public service, And John Adams, he never was very popular. He never was somebody that everybody, really loved, but he actually ended up being the president of the United States, after a period of time. And his attitude was that he would rather make a fortune for the country rather than make his own personal fortune. See, that attitude of self-sacrifice. And that's what paid off in the end, because he knew that he needed to suffer, or he needed to set things in motion simply because they were the right thing to do. See, how many people do you know, and how many of you all out there have done the right thing simply because it was the right thing to do and suffered for it? See, this is that natural aristocrat quality that the forefathers were talking about, because you know that it's going to probably do financial harm, or you're not going to gain the absolute best situation with whatever it is, but you know that it's the right thing to do, and so you're going to do it simply because that's the right thing to do. Benjamin Franklin, he was very staunch about this payment thing for public offices and attaching the finances to those things, because he was over in Europe all the time, and he was seeing this corruption and how it came to pass. And when they were discussing all of this, I'm going to read some of the quotes from Benjamin Franklin's speech that he gave during the process of determining money and putting financial price tags on these positions. Part of the speech, he says, "Sir, there are two passions which have a powerful influence in the affairs of men. These are ambition and avarice, the love of power and the love of money. Separately, each of these has a great force in prompting men to action, but when united in view of the same object, they have in many minds the most violent effects. Place before the eyes of such men a post of honor that shall at the same time be a place of profit, and they shall move heaven and earth to obtain it. The vast number of such places it is that renders the British government so tempestuous. The struggles for them are the true source of all those fashions which are perpetually dividing the nation, distracting its councils, and hurrying them in sometimes to fruitless and mischievous wars, and often compelling the submission to dishonorable terms of peace." So what he's saying there is you make our positions posts of honor and profit both, and you will have the most corrupt people making the most absurd decisions abruptly with the falsest of consequences to them, that we will never be able to resist the corruption that will come into the government. He says, he goes on to say, "And what kind are the men that will strive for this profitable premises, though all the bustle of cabal, the heat of contention, the infinite mutual abuse of parties, tearing to pieces the best of characters, It will not be the wise and moderate, the lovers of peace and good order, the men fittest for the trust. It will be the bold and the violent, the men of strong possession and in